Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the HSC Masterclass this afternoon. My name is Petah Foran, and we'll be looking at the exam skills required to attack section 2 of the paper. We're just going to have a look at two parts of the presentation. Really, is just some of the information that you would need about the skills and that you need to develop, and then we will have a practice. Here are the facts of section 2. We'll have a look at each of these individually. So it is a challenging section. You must answer all parts of the question. Sometimes students get confused because of the structure of the question. What do they actually answer? You don't know the mark value of the parts until the day, and that is probably one of the biggest challenges to attacking this section. But there are ways that you can prepare for that. We'll have a look at that. The writing booklet can be a little bit misleading. I'll get to what I mean by that, but that's largely around how many lines are allocated to each part of the question. Linked questions need to be very carefully answered. We'll have a look at what a linked and an unlinked question looks like. And not everything you study or have studied and prepared for will necessarily be examined in this part or even in all of the paper. What do we do when we realise that all the work that we've done to study HARSH, for example, and there's not a question on it? The short answer is, of course, we just move on. So it's a challenging section. Please do not underestimate the complexity of this section. You cannot double dip. So if you have chosen to do Christianity, for example, in section 3, you cannot do Christianity in section 2. So in your reading time, you have to look at those two lots of questions for section 3 and section 2 very carefully and decide which of your religious traditions you're going to do where. There are 3 parts to each of the questions. They have differing values, which means that you need to allocate different time to each of those sections, remembering that overall you have 30 minutes for the whole question. There are some single element questions versus some, and we'll have a look at what I mean by these, that have a bit more of that integrated feel to them of a section 3 question. And there is no true line guidance for answers in your writing booklet. So do not underestimate the complexity of this section, and planning every response is essential, even if it is a 2-mark question. What are you going to actually write about? Which one are you going to write about first? It's very important for your head and your brain that you get that correct. So answer all parts of the question. SOR 1 students will have 1 question. By question, we mean religion. And I'll show you that an example of that in a moment. Section 2 had to answer 2 questions, so 2 religions. The word question, as it says here, applies to the religion question number, not 1 or 2 parts of the actual question. So this is an example of a section 2 question, and it is 3 separate parts. You need to answer all of these to answer the question. So we've got this annotated here. Question 13, Christianity, that is the question, that is the religion. A is the part, so you have to answer all parts, A, B, and C, of question 13, which is on, in this example, Christianity. So I hope that's clear. Some students think, oh, well, I'll do A in 13 and I'll do B in 14. No, you have to do all of the parts in each of the questions. Oops, I'll go back. This is, I think, the most challenging part of section 2. Actually writing the response aside, is that you don't know until reading time and you open your paper what the mark value of each independent section is going to be. You do know that altogether they will add up to 15, and we do know that they will range in marks from 2 to 9. That's what we do know. So if you have a look on the screen here, you'll be able to see, going back through the HSC and the Catholic trial paper for the last few years, what that breakdown has looked like. We had two separately set papers last year that both ended up in section 2 with a 366 mark breakdown, which was coincidental, that it is not by design in any way, shape or form. 348, 332, 258, 357 around there have been very popular in the last few years. And we have even seen in years previous to 2018 a 9-mark response in the third part of the question. So I guess what I'm trying to say is you don't know what the mark value is going to be. And in a way, it doesn't really matter what the mark value is. The only thing that the mark value will indicate to you is how long you need to write for and approximately how many lines you would be looking at. I'm much more interested in the time that it takes rather than the lines, because that is very, very dependent on how big or otherwise your writing is. So what can you do? You can follow the 1.5 times rule. So 1.5 times the mark value is the writing time. So you will have access to this PowerPoint. It's being recorded, so you don't have to try and frantically write all of this down. This is an indication, a suggestion of what you would be writing and for how long you would be writing, depending on each of those mark values. At the end of the day, it really does also largely, or at the end of the day, it does depend on exactly what the question is. It might be a 6-mark question and it asks you specifically to write about 3 things. So you might have prepared 5, but you're going to actually only write about 3. So it's an indication, it's something that you can sort of be prepared for, particularly in the timing. 30 minutes sounds a long time, but once you're in it and you're planning and you're writing, that time can go by very, very quickly. The writing booklet can be a little bit tricky. Section 2 and 3 are in the same generic writing booklet. So you will have, for one unit, it'll say, here's, section 2, answer your question here. And then it'll leave a spare page and it'll say, here's section 3, start your question here. So you need to be very clear, under pressure, of course, in your exam, where you are at in your writing booklet. For 2-unit students, you've got to negotiate 2 lots of section 2 before you get to the section 3 paper. So knowing where you are is really important in your writing booklet. Section 2, in section 2, students will need to write the question and the part number for each question. And it is just a standard sort of lined at about two times the space. It's just a general lined booklet. It doesn't give you the exact number of lines that you would need, for example, for a 3-mark question, and then the exact number of lines you would need for a 5-mark question in the next part. So there is, as we said here, no line guidance. If you are thinking, well, how do I know about how much time to write, how much length I need to write? 1.5 times for the time, it's about 3 lines per mark for the amount of writing in terms of lines. So you can sort of gauge that a little bit. If it's 6 marks, it's about 18, 20 lines. Again, it depends on how big or small you write. I have larger handwriting. It gets larger again in an exam situation under pressure. So I would probably I could write the exact same response as another student. They might have 15 lines and I might have 25 lines. So that's where the timing is far more critical, I think, than exactly how many lines you have. Linked questions. So we're seeing a lot of these in section 2, and a lot of them particularly around ethics, and I think that's the example that I've given you. They're on the same syllabus aspect, so ethics or person and person. The second part may or may not rely on the first part. If it is, you need to be very careful about what each part is asking for you. If the second part is reliant on the first part, you have to use something that you've written about in the first part, in the second part. So that's where it gets a bit tricky. But I've got an example here. So this was, I think, the question that we had before. This is just on Christianity. It really doesn't matter the religious tradition. This is a non-reliant question. So it's a straight A on ethics, B is on person, C is on practice. Nothing is relying on anything else. It's simple, it's straightforward. We just answer each question as it stands on the paper. This question is a reliant question. So you have to outline the contribution of one significant person, then say how that person has provided Christians with a distinctive answer to the enduring questions. At the marking centre, the criteria is very, very clear, because this is asking, this A2 says, how is the significant person described in part A1? So if you talk about Paul in A1, and then you're talking, for example, about John the 23rd in part 2, you are not going to be awarded any marks at all, because you're not talking about the person that you talked about in A1. So it is a reliant question, but it would be fairly hard, I would imagine, to mess that up, but you'd be surprised what students can do to make it difficult for themselves. This is a reliant question where what you do in A, again, is what you have to do in part 2, and it says it at part A2, and it says outlined in part A1. So if you do marriage as your significant practice, and that's what you've written about in A1, you have to say how it is significant for the community in part A2. So don't get confused and try and think that or just get confused generally and start to write about something else. You can only write about marriage because that's all that you've actually learned. Other students have done baptism, that's what they will write about. Other students, again, have done Saturday and Sunday worship, that's what they write about. So it looks like you've got an option there, but you actually don't. You have to write about what it was that you learned. This is another example of a reliant question, and these are the ones where you have to be absolutely very clear about what you have to do. A1 says describe one core ethical teaching. A2 then says how does the ethical teaching described in A1 encourage Christians to live? So you need to do the teaching, then show how it's applied. So you need to be very clear about what you understand by teaching. One core teaching of Christianity with environmental ethics, for example, is stewardship. How is that applied is what is A2. How does the ethical teaching, how does stewardship encourage Christians to live? This is how you would show how stewardship is put into practice in terms of daily living and in terms of approaches to environmental issues. So, for example, deforestation. So deforestation is not your core ethical teaching, stewardship is, and then how is that applied? That's where you bring in your what you've researched around your ethical issues. Sometimes, I don't think I have an example of it here, but sometimes question A1 might be to describe 2 ethical teachings, and then A2 will be how does one of those teachings. So again, you've got to please read the questions very carefully. I always tell my students, you need to read all the words in the question. So slow yourself down, make sure that you know exactly what the question is asking you to do. If you do deforestation, you say, okay, one ethical, environmental ethical teaching in A1 is deforestation, you're not actually addressing the question. You're probably not going to get any marks for it. You've now confused yourself in A2. You're going to repeat deforestation down in there, and it's not on the question. You haven't answered the question in the first place. So I'm not sure my screen is in the way. How much is this worth? 8 marks. So you are putting in jeopardy 8 marks if you don't get, if you don't read the question properly and get it right. And don't expect everything. Here, for example, in the 2021 trial paper, CSSA trial, everything that you had to learn was in one way, shape or form on the paper. In the 2018 HSC for Christianity, it was everything, but it wasn't, it was everything altogether, but not in section 2. And in 2018 HSC for Islam, for example, unless you did ethics in section 3, you could have answered that entire exam without even touching one aspect of the paper. Because remember, if you do section 2 Christianity, you're not going to do section 3 Christianity. If you're doing section 2 Islam, you're not going to do section 3 Islam. So for example, in this paper, if I chose section 2 for Christianity, I would do practice, ethics. I had not touched my person at all. And then in Islam, I do section 3, which was integrated on the good life. So that could be your practice and your ethical, whichever ethical option that you've done. So I teach environmental ethics, in which case, again, person has not been touched. So I walked out of that paper having spent 14 hours probably at least in the classroom learning about my 2 people, and I've never written anything about it. That is the reality. You can't do anything about it. You just have to accept that that's the way it is, and then you just move on. Oh, the other thing, yes, this is the other thing too. You might have done a whole lot of stuff around ethical teaching for Christianity in 2021, and you go in there and you think, yes, this is good. Ethics, it's only worth 3 marks. That's all you have to write about. Again, it is the reality of the paper. You just have to answer the question that's presented to you on the day, and then you need to move on, and there's nothing that you can do about it. Try not to, as I tell my students, get emotionally involved with the paper. That's not going to end well for you. So I thought that we would do some practice. We're just going to change screens. Okay, I'm not the most technically efficient person, so here you go. All right, here's an example. I think this is the one, a similar one that we were looking at earlier in the presentation. So this was the 2020 trial question for Christianity. That's it as it stands. I wanted you to have a look at it. But I want to have a look, first of all, before we look at breaking down the question of what we might write. What were the marking criteria for the 5 and 7 markers? So I put the 5 marker up here first. So what I want you to be very clear about is that there are 2 things that the marker's looking for. They're looking for skills and content. A lot of students are very keen to get everything down that they've learned for content, and they forget that they have to do something with the content. So let's say that red is our content. So this, making statements, making general statements, some understanding, terminology, going terminology here, detail, accurate and detailed understanding. That's all your content. But let's say that we have green is going to be our skills. You have to demonstrate it, and you have to demonstrate how it does this. You have to integrate terminology here. The same as this, you have to reintegrate relevant examples in terminology. You have to demonstrate here again this level of understanding in terms of encouraging Christians to live. So hopefully what I want you to see is that the higher you go up, the higher you go up the mark, now it's all gone. The higher you go up the mark range, the more skills are involved.
There's more skills here. There's more content, only content down here. So yes, it's important that you know your content, but it's what to do with the content that becomes critically important in these short answer questions. You don't have a lot of time or space. You need to really hit your mark straight away. We can do the same thing here in terms of content. Again, general statements. May use some terminology. In a 1 to 2 mark range in a 7 mark question, you're using terminology probably more by accident than design. So we're making some general statements. We may make some reference to the stimulus, but again, you don't need a great lot of skill to do that. The stimulus is there for you. This is where our content starts to come in. You've got to provide the information and show how it's made a valuable contribution. You've actually got to demonstrate that. An extent. Yes, the extent is this is our verb. So that's skill. That's all skill based. Here you've got to integrate relevant and accurate terminology and make sustained use of the stimulus. Support the assessment with the evidence. Again, you need to, the extent to which the chosen practice has made a contribution. This is your content. Some of this evidence is content, but you have to integrate it into your response. I think says Buddhism, I've obviously taken it on. So as you can see, as you go up the mark ranges, you are more reliant on skill at the top end of the mark ranges rather than you are down the bottom. So how are we going to answer this question? Hopefully fairly simply. This is a reliant question. And again, I think it's important that we show how the teaching links to the issues down here. So that's what I wanted to see on these 3 and 5 markers. Your 3 markers going to be planned out exactly the way you would plan out your essay. So your verb is to describe, and you are describing one core ethical teaching. Christianity, we do environmental ethics. Again, you do the option that you've been taught. You don't do anything with it now. In terms of describing one core ethical teaching, you would need to define the teaching. You would need a sentence that includes textual support, depending on the teaching. It depends, I guess, on the textual support. Scripture would be the preference, but it could be something else. Environmental ethics, stewardship. If you're doing in Christianity, you might want to use something from Laudato Si if you're focusing on Catholicism. And then the last thing that you would have here is how it links to an issue. So if you're using stewardship, if you would define it, this is what it is. Here is where it is in stewardship about having dominion or taking care, depending on whether you're using Genesis 1 or 2. And then this links to how we would live in terms of reducing global warming or reducing deforestation in our community. So it's quite straightforward, but you need to plan it out. Then you would simply go along and you would write a nice little 3-4 sentence response that just describes that core ethical teaching. So let's assume then we're going to stick with stewardship. Now it's asking, so how does? So this is your explaining verb. So you need to do, this is the cause and effect. Or relationship. You've got to show the relationship now between what is taught and what is lived. And you're going to use this language, encourage Christians to live. So stewardship encourages Christians to live 5 marks. So So you're after about 3 points. So stewardship encourages Christians to live in a certain way in their daily life. And then in terms of their response to, and which may or may not include daily different environmental issues. And then you might also look broader than that in terms of the work of organisations. So if you have done deforestation, you might look at things like, well, to reduce the use of paper, you might recycle. You might recycle your paper, buy paper products that are made from recycled paper, recycled toilet paper, anything around that. If you've done global warming or climate change, then it could be around reducing your carbon footprint. That is taking care of the environment that we have been gifted by God. So global warming, so it could be walking, riding a bike, catching public transport, perhaps not on any given Wednesday because they're always on strike, but catching public transport. It could be turning the lights off. It could be turning the tap off when you brush your teeth. It's having shorter showers. Anything that, if you're doing water conservation, anything that is going to reduce what it is that you take from the environment. Because that's what stewardship is all about. It's taking what you need and only what you need, and making sure that everyone then has, the environment itself has an opportunity to rejuvenate itself so that it continues to provide for your needs. Then if you've looked up an organisation to do with stewardship, I know in Islam, a lot of the kids look up Green Muslim, for example, but you wouldn't do that here, obviously, it's Christianity. But what are the work of organisations? So what are they doing? Oops. And how might you as an adherent, how might an adherent support their work? So at the end of the day, so at the end of the day, you've got 1 point here, 1 point here, and 1 point here. That's 3 parts for your 5-mark response. All the time, you are saying that stewardship encourages Christians to. Just some shorthand here. Okay. Would prefer that they did this. That's encouragement. Something around guiding so that they would then make the decision to. All of this language is around encouragement. So you just need to put all of that. It depends on what you have done, but you can tweak this. This is just your outline. You can tweak the details to whatever it is that you've studied in class in terms of your teachings and in terms of the environmental issues that you've studied. Now, if you're doing bioethics, it works the same way. So, you know, the dignity of human life, for example, that becomes your teaching that you've done in A1. Now, how does that work in terms of 2 or 3 of the issues that you've studied? So if you're doing bioethics, you might have looked at euthanasia, for example, very topical at the moment. You might be looking at stem cell research perhaps, but maybe more around IVF. Okay, so you're looking at those sorts of options. How is dignity of human life relate to what is it that I am going to do in that situation? How am I going to support or otherwise organisations? Sexual ethics, exactly the same thing. So the ethical teaching could be that sexual relationships should be complementary. That means between a man and a woman. So what does that look like in terms of marriage? What does that look like in terms of same-sex sexual relationships? So, and then what might a Christian then choose to do what decision might they make in terms of euthanasia or homosexual relationships in terms of fulfilling that central teaching that we've been talking about. I hope that's feels like. Okay, and this is B. This is, we're seeing this all the time. I would expect stimulus material here. So let's go to the black. Significant people and schools of thought. So whatever you've done, this is your person. How do they guide adherence? And the question is really in two ways. To a deeper level of both understanding and engagement. This is what I know. This is what I do. Pretty much. So with reference to the quotation, even if it didn't say this, the expectation at the marking centre is that if stimulus is given, stimulus is used. Here's your verb, assess the value for the adherence of what one significant person or school of thought has given to the tradition. So what I tell my students is, when it says contribution of a significant person or school of thought within Christianity, is to actually cross that out and write your words. In our case, that would be John the 23rd. Read your question again. Assess the value for adherence of the contribution of John. That is much simpler language to get your head around in an exam than all of these extra words. They have to put all of those extra words in because not everyone's done the same person or school of thought. So how has John guided adherents? Again, we've got this guide to a deeper level of understanding, knowing their faith, and doing all the living of their faith. So we talk about, remember, it's 7 marks, so you probably need a good 3 to 4 points here. So we will talk about John as a role model and how to live as a baptised Christian. How does one live out one's call as a baptised Christian? We talk about John in terms of his broader vision for the kingdom of God and how that is established. And we talk about what John teaches in terms of community, and we give some examples we use there are humanism and interfaith dialogue. And then if you wanted to put one more in there, you could look at what he did in terms of, and this is where the specifically Catholic part of his contribution comes in, is making the faith more accessible for Christians, for Catholics in particular. And that in, of course, is in terms of Vatican II and some of the changes that he made in terms of liturgy and in terms of canonical law there as well. So how is he guiding adherents? He's guiding adherents to do their faith by following his example. So I'm just going to change colours. By following his example. And if you've done John the 23rd, you might want to talk about how he left the Vatican walls and went and visited hospitals, the children in particular. He visited prisons. He washed the feet of prisoners on Thursday. Holy Thursday, that's the Holy Thursday. Anything that he's done, anything that he's said that shows how one should live out their baptismal call. A broader vision of the kingdom of God and how that's established. This is very much in terms of peace, his emphasis on peace. And his encyclical that was addressed to men, which includes women, all men of goodwill. first time ever that an Catholic encyclical was addressed to people other than Catholics. Sounds not so important for us today, probably because we've lived with that for so long, but that was groundbreaking at the time. How do they, and also the living again here with ecumenism and interfaith dialogue. And if you're really clever, you've done this in post 45, so you're going to talk about what John did, but then how that continues today. Because he continues to guide adherents. You are making a judgment, remember. So you're saying how that continues today. And if you've done post 45, you've done both of these, and you've got examples of Christian ecumenical initiatives here in Australia, and the same with interfaith dialogue. So you don't need to go and find new information. You've got it in a different part of your syllabus, and you just bring it across because you already know it and you'll apply it here. One thing Australians do very well is ecumenism and interfaith dialogue. So that's a really good example. And this making the faith more accessible, you could put here an understandable, because this is where you are going to bring in your quote. To know their faith. They know it through participating. And they participate in the liturgy. They don't participate in canonical law, but at least it gives them an understanding of why they do what they do. So again, it's only 7 marks. You're looking at 7, 4, 11, 12, 13 minutes of writing. It's not a long time. It's not a lot of lines, so you've got to be really succinct. Here's your point, here's your example, then you're moving on. And of course, anything that you can do to quote John. If you're going to talk about your encyclical on peace here, Pacem and Terrace, you would need to quote something from it. But that's all going to be in your notes anyway. So you've got all the information back in. That looks very messy. Okay, so we can do the same thing with Islam. So this is the 2020 HSC question. All right. You've got this reliant question over here, practice, and then you've got ethics down the bottom. So no person here. Again, this is the trial. The first question was the trial. This question's the HSC, but we can still see exactly here. You have to demonstrate an understanding of significance, and you have to integrate relevant and accurate terminology. Oh. Look at this up terminology. And this is understanding. This is your content. Okay, this is your content. But this is your skill. Once you get down to here, your content, you're making general statements, you're making a statement. So your skills, these are your skills again. So it's not just that the trial marking criteria does it that way. This is HSC marking criteria. It's doing exactly the same thing. This is the 8 mark, 8 marks this year in this year. So the 8 marks, you can see the same thing. So if we go to skills, how? Uses clear and relevant evidence in support of the response, integrates the terminology. This is so there's a lot of skill involved in this. This is all content. I would be using some. It's almost negligible down. Okay. All right, so how would we attack this question? Outline one significant practice. So outline is your verb. So that's just a sketch. It's worth 3 marks. So again, you've just got 3 essential points in just 3 simple sentences. The emphasis here is on the word essential. Outline again, you can actually take that off and just put heart, we do heart. You put heart there, outline heart for 3 marks. You get rid of all of this. It's too distracting. We don't need it. Okay. So here, 3 points to outline heart. You would say probably that it is a pilgrimage, of course, to Mecca, specifically the Kaaba. Let's put your Quranic quote in there. You know, it's a duty to the house of Allah for those who find their way thither. So the Quran's read from it. You would then say that it is done annually. It involved with particular rites and rituals. You've got your Quranic quote anyway, but if you wanted to, you could then give 1 or 2 examples of that. You could say that it is a spiritual, physical and mental journey. You could say that it was undertaken by Muhammad, by many of the prophets, including Abraham and Muhammad. But you just need 3 really simple things. Make sure you've got your textual support in there. So it's a similar process to how we looked at how would you just outline a teaching, ethical teaching. Okay. So what is the significance for the community? So really work with your paper, follow them around. It's 4 marks. You could do just a couple of points with a little bit of detail. So we teach that religion in the premium course, that religion has particular contributions to the community. This is what we pick up here. So we would say that heart provides social cohesion would be 1. Social cohesion, because we're talking about community. It a collective identity. And then if you wanted to add a 3rd one there, it's an opportunity to express belief. So if they were the 3 that you were going to do, you would show how this is done by 3 million people at the same time every year. If nothing suggests ummah to you and a sense of social cohesion of 3 million people all dressed the same, doing the same thing at the same time, nothing will. Collective identity is your ikram. You can also have look at it in terms of also Eid and the sacrifice and the support that, and also the sacrifice there is sent around the world to the poor. Opportunity to express belief, pick a belief, it doesn't really matter, whatever belief you want. Day of judgment. Sorry, I do use a lot of shorthand. And show how at Waquf, at Mount Arafat, the Day of Judgment is the Muslim adherents on pilgrimage get a taste of that Day of Judgment as they stand at Mount Arafat for hours on end, begging forgiveness from God. At the place where Muslims believe Adam and Eve reconciled with Allah after the fall. So it makes this even more poignant. So 3 simple things. You could even just stop it at 2 and just do a little bit more in depth. If you've got a Quranic quote or a hadith to support any one of those points, I would put them in there. But you're looking at 6 minutes of writing in about 12 lines. You're not looking at a lot, so you just need to be very succinct and spot on. And this is B. So again, we see the stimulus. But as for those who believed and did righteous deeds, He, Allah, will give them in full their rewards, and Allah does not like wrongdoers. I think I put the question twice by the word. How does, so this is your explain, how does this give guidance to adherents in terms of going with the environment? So how does this give guidance in terms of environmental ethics? This is an 8-mark response, so there's a little bit more detail involved in this. But if you are talking about giving guidance, this is the teaching, but this is a teaching that supports the core ethical teachings in terms of the environment. And you might choose to do maybe 3 there. So we would do Tawhid, we would look at Amana maybe, the trust, and Khalifa, which is a lot like stewardship really. This of course is for your, these are your guardians, your environmental guardians. So this says those who believe in deep righteous deeds, they're doing, so Muslims are doing righteous deeds when they follow the teachings. And when they follow their teachings, what is it that they do? When they are following this teaching, when they are recognizing the oneness of Allah within the created world, what are they going to do? So you'd have to link it to an issue. And when they do or do not do, whatever that guidance says, they will receive full reward. And Allah does not like those who go against what his teachings are. Actually, if you're looking at their rewards, and if you've done environmental ethics here, you might want to focus on the teaching of Akra. Not that we're getting rid of Tawhid, but if you did Akra here, you've got a nice little structure. You can say that Allah has created the world, and part of that creation is to entrust humanity with a particular job. That job is to guard the world and to keep it in the balance, within the balance and harmony. Balance, of course, is Nizam. The balance and harmony that he has created the world. And then Akra then becomes your 3rd one. And on the Day of Judgment, a Muslim will be held to account for how they have exercised this, this gift from Allah to take care of the environment. And if they have exercised that duty well, then Allah will give them their full rewards. So if that makes sense. And those who are believed, of course, these are Muslims. So anytime you want to use adherents or Muslims, you might want to put in, and for those who believe in the teachings of the Quran, etc., then you're automatically referring to adherents, but you're using the stimulus. So it's just a little easy way to get the stimulus in there as well.
So we have a question. Writing enough, addressing all parts of section 2 questions. Oh, the question was, what are your tips for writing enough detail and addressing all parts of section 2 questions? So writing enough will be according to the mark value of the particular question. So if the question we had just up there was on 8 marks about ethical teachings, it didn't specify how many. I'd be inclined to do 3, or I just don't think you've got enough room for 4, but 3 questions, 3 teachings, and show how they actually relate to how Muslims actually live. What decisions are they going to make in terms of whichever your environmental ethical area is? As I said, we do environmental ethics. So in terms of the environment, what are Muslims going to do in terms of trying to reduce the amount of trees that are being used for buildings and papers and things like that? What are they going to do to reduce their carbon footprint? What are they going to do to support proper treatment of animals, which is really big in Islam? Muhammad was very, very clear on the fact that animals were to be treated properly. They cannot provide for themselves if we are using them for work, so we are to take care of their needs before our own. So it really depends on the scope of the question, but if you have a look at this slide here, how much do you write? It depends on how many points you want to make. As I've said a few times, be succinct. You do not have all day to waffle here. Your marker just wants to see that you've got the essentials there and that you've answered the question well. I guess on that point, just remember that only one person sees this response, these 3 sections. So yes, it's worth 15 in total, but not one section is worth 10 marks or more. One part is worth 10 marks or more. So therefore, only one person marks the entire 3 parts of that question. You need to make it very clear straight away that you are on task and here's what the question's asking of me. You've got a little bit more room in your essay to get, actually you don't have room in your essay to get flowery. You just need to answer the question. Yeah.
Another question.
Another question. Do we need to add evidence such as quotes for a 3 marker? I would have a quote in there. Yes. Some sort of textual support. Yep, I definitely. It could be something, if it's person, it could be something that the person said. If it's a practice, it could be something from scripture that gives rise to that practice. If it's an ethic, it would be something from scripture that supports the ethical teaching that you've just defined. Definitely have a quote in there to support. Is it essential to highlight? I would say yes, but I'm a highlighter, I'm a highlighting person. What's essential is not so much to highlight, but to break down the question as we've just demonstrated, to actually circle your key terms, to cross out the bits that aren't that are too wordy so that you cut it down to just Hajj or just Friday prayer at the mosque, for example. It just helps your brain to focus in on what it needs to answer that question and get rid of everything else that's in the background that's sort of clouding the situation. You don't want to get confused. So working to break down the question with your pen, not during reading time, of course, but when you get to write it, it just focuses, it sharpens the mind on what it needs to focus on to answer the question. But you don't need a highlighter to do that. How many practice papers should we do a night? I wouldn't do a whole paper at once. I'd do parts of the paper, looking at sticking to that time limit, and I would do only a couple of parts, because what you need is feedback on that before you continue, because you might practice that 8 times in a night and actually what you've done is you've practiced really bad habits and you've reinforced those in your brain. So you need that feedback from your teacher. So a couple of sections or a couple of questions in a particular question, in a particular section, that would be all. Then get feedback. Feedback is critical. Okay, thank you. I hope you've learned something in terms of skills that will help you. At this point, it's all about practice. The more you practice, the better your skills will get. And at some point, if you look at enough questions, in your HSC, you will come across something that you've seen or something very similar to what you've seen before. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.